A very good afternoon to you all. It's been a while since I've been on this stage here with SMMT. I understand our panel is sitting between you and your lunch, so we'll try and make and build an appetite as we go along. I'm going to paint, in very short, a picture of what future of manufacturing looks like, and then I'm going to ask my panelists to join me, and then we'll start the panel discussion. But before, just quick 2-minute overview of who we are. I don't know many of you know Markets and Markets. We are a young startup company. We provide market intelligence and consulting advisory services, similar to companies like S&P or some of the accounting-based consulting firms. And what underlines what we do is really a knowledge store platform, which I call the Netflix of research. So just like if you like to watch certain movies, it sort of brings everything together in terms of upstream, midstream, downstream together. So let's start with me telling a little bit about what the future of manufacturing looks like. So let's just look at in this slide what's the evolution of Industry 5.0. So not very far from here, when we found molecules, it gave rise to Industrial Revolution 1. And then when we found electrons and we found fossil fuels, we sort of moved into Industry 2.0. Ford led that transition. You could buy any car as long as it was black and it was a Model T. Then we found waves, we found computers, and we saw automation. My team's doing some work on autonomous world, and very interestingly, the first automation department was set up in the 1940s by guess who? Ford. So the auto industry has always led this transition into industry manufacturing. Today we sit on Industry 4.0, and the future is Industry 5.0. The European Union describes Industry 5.0 around sustainability, and it's more than just mass-producing vehicles. One of my colleagues written a book on this, on Industry 5.0, and he describes it as ESG plus fourth industrial revolution multiplied by the Sustainable Development Goals. In other words, what he's talking about is not mass production, but it's about using AI, it's about using sustainability to develop mass customization and mass personalization. So let's look at what the future of auto manufacturing looks like. With the geopolitical challenges that we see, with the supply chain issues that we see, and also with the development of skateboard architectures, electric vehicles, we believe the electric vehicle manufacturing, zero-emission vehicle manufacturing is going to change on its head. We're going to see new concepts like white label factories, microfactories, and also final assembly factories. So I think those days we're going to build a plant with hundreds of thousands of units of vehicles produced. I think they're going to be very few in the future. So what we see is the auto industry moving from what we call Kaizen, continuous improvement as we all know it, to what we call Kakushin. Now if you look at a skateboard architecture of electric vehicle today, and if you're doing cell-to-pack manufacturing, or if you're putting cell-to-body, 60-70% of the BOM cost sits in that EV skateboard, compared to an ICE engine, which is merely around 30-40%. With modularization coming in, and with some of these micro modular factories that we will see, you will see lower capex. And as you see on the picture here on this slide on the right-hand side, with things like gigacasting coming in. And I think gigacasting is quite revolutionary, in my opinion. Steel makes up only 50% of the car today. With gigacasting, it will be reduced by another 15-20%. And in particular, with the body in white, it has huge implications. So instead of having a factory which looks like on the left, you will have factories that look like more on the right. So they're much more labor intensive. There's less robotics, less welding robots in there, lower space, lower capex spend. And so just to set the scene with my last slide is, what does Industry 5.0 really mean? So it means 5G factories. We already see that, for example, with GM, with BMW setting them up. We see cloud being used in manufacturing. We've seen an example of Volkswagen, where they put all their 100-plus plants on one cloud. So they're able to look at factory production across all the world. We see the development of manufacturing metaverse. In particular, with manufacturing metaverse, we see the use of AR, VR. We see the use of 3D printing. We see the use of cognitive configurators. And talking about 3D manufacturing, I think we've sort of given up on 3D, but I think there's still a lot to go. I did a project last year with the FTSE 100 company. They make industrial products. They make things like valves. Each valve costs something like 2 to 3 million or even more. What we found when we did part of the work for them is they don't need these factories. 3D printing can manufacture those parts for them. Now, 70% of their revenues come from the aftermarket. What if their customers start putting those 3D printers on their shop floors? How do they manage that business? So we also see a shift in business models, 3D printing as a service type of business models coming in. So with that, let me try and invite my panelists to the floor, please.
The UK auto industry can excel in the design, development, and deployment of next generation of automotive technologies, which is electrification, hydrogen, software-defined vehicle, and autonomous vehicles.
While 2023 saw significant investment into the UK automotive sector, the biggest opportunities for sustainable tyre manufacturing need to be driven by a strong regulatory environment, consumer demand for a better product, and initiatives to stimulate manufacturing excellence.
I would anticipate organisations spending an awful lot more time focused on managing supply chain risk. And I could see organisations that are getting that really well are the ones that are going to win over the next few years.
Excellent. Welcome, everybody. Let me start by asking a first open question. Do you agree with what I said, or am I talking bollocks here?
That's a bit of a loaded question, isn't it? I'm not sure how to answer that. Yeah, it's going to get more and more complex, isn't it? And the manufacturing arrangements to support the new products that are coming out are going to be more complex. I mean, when I look at what I think is perhaps missing from your opening dialogue was a conversation about the external risk environment that these organisations are operating in, the geopolitical risk, the supply chain risks that we're exposed to, the cyber risks. Yeah, with more automation, with more use of 3D printing and other sort of solutions, those sorts of exposures to those broader risks are going to get more and more severe, I think, for companies.
Thank you, James. Robert?
For comic effect, I'd love to say you were talking bollocks, but no, unfortunately, I think I agree with all of it. I think the one bit for me which is key to it is as the complexity increases, we have to still find simplicity within the complexity so that we can still afford to manufacture our products at the right price point, because the world market is getting smaller. We've talked about China advancing and the pressures that puts on the UK. So we have to turn this increased complexity into a commercial advantage in order to make sense, and I think that it will.
Excellent. Sam?
I'd agree from a purely manufacturing point of view. It's definitely on that trajectory, but what we've got to wrap around is the people element to it, because those plants are still going to employ quite a lot of staff to monitor and develop those processes, even though they'll become more and more automated. So it's a case of having those likely to be new plants, but in the right places where you can get the right people and the right skills to be able to operate it and deliver value to the sites in and around the factory as a whole.
Excellent. So I'm glad I'm not talking bollocks. That's good. So how is the UK auto industry responding to this change and shift? I'll start with you.
Well, I was going to talk about the complexity of the risk environment is so much more challenging for organisations. And one of the points I wanted to get across here today was just how good this sector is at adapting to those kind of challenges. I mean, you showed it on the screen behind you when you were talking through the history of some of these technological changes. Many of them come from the automotive industry. I can see that happening now. The response to what is happening geopolitically, the response to the climate change threats, that has been a subject of every speaker that's come up here and spoken today. So I'm super positive about how this industry is going to grasp those challenges for the future. One of the areas that I think is changing quite drastically from my perspective, we're an insurance broker by trade. We don't make any cars, but or vehicles, but we support customers in insuring them, is that there's a significant amount of innovation going on at the moment in the insurance industry, which probably isn't on the top of many people's agendas as something to look at, but actually is fundamental as an underpinning enabler for growth. When you are investing in new technologies, when you are partnering with new partners, building new supply chain relationships, there's a lot of uncertainty attached to all of those decisions. And one way of managing that uncertainty is to buy insurance. And that's, it may be pretty dull, but that is what underpins the growth. And in the UK, we are lucky to have an extremely innovative and forward-thinking insurance market. We invented it here as a concept with Lloyd's. And some of the challenges that you will all be facing around the cost of claims related to EV models, for example, being more expensive to repair versus ICE models, issues with certain brands having difficulty getting access to insurance on the open market. There are solutions available working with your brokers to meet those challenges. For example, implementing a captive insurance program to mitigate some of the uninsurable risks that some of the insurance companies external to your business are comfortable covering. So don't discount the role of insurance. It may be a little bit dull, but it's super important for your growth.
Yeah, James, my insurance gone up. I'm going to talk to you later about that. Robert, what's your view? How is the UK automotive manufacturing responding to these changes?
So I think if speaking from my part of the industry, being the bus industry, I think we're responding very well. I mean, building on our past successes, I think, is important for all of us. And I mean, Wrightbus, we built our first battery electric bus in 1998, our first fuel cell electric bus in 2006. And today we're the leading player in the marketplace in terms of market share. And that's really come from staying as close as we can to our customers. So as we transition from Industry 4.0 to 5.0, it only makes sense if we can really continue to grow as a business if our customers are growing and our customers are happy. So it's about staying as close to them as possible, because there are so many pressures from external influencers, and the only way you can help manage those is by helping your customer on that journey to make sure that they are actually getting the product that they want at a price that they can afford to pay. Because if they can't afford to pay the price, you'll end up either they'll be out of business or you'll be out of business. So it's really vital that everybody stays close together. And I think there was a really good point made in one of the earlier sessions. I think it was the gentleman from Hyundai who was talking about increasing warranties. And I think warranties are absolutely critical for the industry going forward. I mean, our buses are designed to last 15 to 20 years. And if we tell somebody that our battery pack's designed to last that same length of time, but our warranty's for 3 years, they're going to assume that the battery's not going to last 15 years, for example. So, and I think the same applies across the whole industry. We have to be able to back up what we believe the strengths in our products is with warranties to keep our customers happy. And if we don't do that, it's going to make the transition from diesel as it is today to zero emissions significantly harder. And it's not just in the length of time of the warranties, it's also making the warranties simplistic, so that people don't look at them and think, well, actually this looks great, but the more I dig into the details, I'll never be able to stand through this, people can get around it, it's not worth the paper it's written on. So for me, it's a key enabler to growing this industry going forward.
Thank you, Robert. And Sam?
So I think there's two angles of change happening quite quickly. One that we've just touched on there, which is going from Industry 4.0 to 5.0. And some of that's to do with production efficiencies, to make sure we've got a handle on the cost, we've got better production quality control, more consistent manufacturing. The other element is that we've got to drive much more towards the net zero production. And that's definitely something that here in this country, and I think more importantly this collection of countries, which is a theme that we'll come back onto shortly, is that we remember that that's one of the key elements. And we've definitely got the innovation here. We've definitely got the skills to build on that, and we've got the creativity. There are some issues around the scalability of those when they're deployed, But I think it's starting from a very strong position, and we've just got to capitalise on the skills that we've already got here and really unlock it as we move forwards.
Thank you, Sam. James, I talked briefly about how geopolitical pressures and supply chain is having a big impact on future of manufacturing. What's your view on supply chain resilience?
How long have you got? We don't know enough about our supply chains. I think that's where my starting point. Transparency about who you're actually partnering with, not your tier one suppliers, but their suppliers and their suppliers' suppliers, is really where most of the risk sits in organizations. We see a lot of that coming through in insurance claims. A lot of the big business disruptions originate deep within the supply chain, and they come as a bit of a surprise because nobody really sees it coming because you don't know you've got that dependency. So I think there's a real opportunity to do a lot more work around building resilience into our supply chains, and it starts with gaining visibility, knowing who your third or fourth tier suppliers might be, what kind of risks they're exposed to, and that could be child labour, it could be deforestation risk in the Amazon rainforest, it could be single points of failure somewhere lurking deep within the supply chain. All of that needs to be given some visibility and shine a light on it. The challenge, I guess, we have had historically is that the manual way of gaining that visibility, asking your tier ones to fill forms in, to do due diligence deep within the supply chain, takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of investment. But there are new approaches that have only really just come available recently where we can very rapidly map an organization's supply chain by looking for clues within effectively shipping data to build a picture of how an organization's supply chain works. There's a large OEM, I won't say the name, who spent about 4 years mapping about 40% of their tier one supply chain. Large team that was doing it. Using that new approach, that big data with analytics sort of supporting it, they did the same thing in 72 hours. So it just shows you what is possible. And that's not about saying that that organization was doing it incorrectly. They weren't. They were using the tools that they had available to them at the time. But recent advances in data analytics and availability of that data has meant they can get there quicker. And it means that all the people that were doing the mapping can now spend time managing the actual risk, which actually has more of an impact on the organisation. And I'll give you one very recent example of why this matters. For those of you that export into the US markets, the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act, which effectively stops anything entering the US customs area if there is a hint of it coming from that region of China where there is a higher risk of forced labour from Uyghur groups. There have been some very high-profile automotives that have been impacted by that recently. This year alone, about $1.4 billion worth of goods have been stopped at the border. And what's interesting, when you look at the data that the customs authorities in the US are releasing about those stoppages, a vast majority of them are not coming directly from China. They're coming from third countries like Malaysia, Thailand. So they're sort of tier threes in China going to a tier two to a tier one to your customers ultimately in the US, but they still get stopped. And for a lot of organizations, the first time you realize you've got that problem is when you get the phone call from the customs authority.
And so would technology or legislation like digital product passports change that in the future?
I mean, there's advances in that coming down the track, and I think yes, eventually, particularly for sort of some of the critical minerals that go into batteries and supporting other manufacturing processes. I can see that being an area for us to spend more time innovating in over the course of the next 5 years, but we're not there yet.
Okay. Question for you, Robert. I know the Wrightbus and the Bamford Group is quite big in hydrogen. Tell us a little bit about what does it mean to have a hydrogen economy, and what does it mean for automotive and especially in your business?
Sure. So, I mean, hydrogen is very interesting. but it has to be the right technology for the end user in order to be successful. So when we produced our first fuel cell buses in 2006, and we've got over 100 of them in service within about a mile of where we are today. So we know the product very well, and the main challenges with it for us aren't actually on the product side. I mean, in terms of procuring the right components, the UK's okay on that side of it. I mean, our bill of materials is roughly 55% UK for our fuel cell vehicles, so it's slightly higher by about 5% than our battery electric vehicles. But we'd obviously like to increase that significantly going forward. But the challenge isn't so much on the product. I mean, the product's proven, it works well. However, we're not currently selling it into the UK. The vast majority of our sales of this product are now into Germany, and the primary reason for that is just the infrastructure side of it. Today, if you wanted to buy a zero-emission bus in the UK, we'll work with you. We have a very strong team in a research facility that we own in Queen's University in Belfast, and we'll work with the customer to check all of the various different inputs and outputs that they need to try and inform them what's the right product for them to use. And quite simply, hydrogen in the UK today is too difficult from a supply chain point of view, and that's really stopping that technology, whereas it's the complete opposite, for example, in Germany. The key enablers for that are quite simply green hydrogen production and investment in infrastructure then to both transport the hydrogen and then to refuel the vehicles. And once you have that in place, the vehicles work very, very well, very consistent, very reliable. So certainly, I still think it'll play a big part in decarbonising going forward, but we're not quite there yet in terms of the infrastructure side.
Interesting, because hydrogen is the next big thing. I think maybe in the UK have lost the plot getting into electric vehicles, but definitely that's an area we could maybe focus on. Talking about that, maybe Sam, question for you. What do you think should be the key pillars of our industrial strategy going forward?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most important things that we'll cover, certainly from a manufacturing point of view. And I'm looking around and seeing a fairly friendly audience, and I'm aware that I might just be about to lose everybody in the room in one statement. But we announced last night the launch of a manufacturing facility, which would be our first owned one, as opposed to having an offtake agreement in the United States. There's some good reasons for that in terms of proximity to market, in terms of the size of the market. But one of the other things that we found, and it wasn't a deciding factor, but it's something that we can learn some lessons from to bring back, is that once that momentum was on board, it felt like you were on a travelator bringing all of the different solutions together. There were elements of state funding, elements of private funding, elements of the different states vying for business and explaining sort of why you should go there, what energy supplies they had, which brownfield sites for redevelopment. I'm sure we'll find the trap at the end of the line, but at the minute things are accelerating, and being a new company, that momentum's absolutely critical, because you're not sitting on sort of big reserves to be able to wait for 6 months, 12 months longer to see if it's even feasible. So it's been announced, feasibility study straight in, and we're going. I think the good news story for the UK is that we've not used any building blocks out there in the US, which we don't have, and it's UK-wide, and I think it's just the ability to join those up, be that planning, be that government relations sort of north and south of the border. We've got the energy. A lot of that's in Scotland. There's going to be energy transition job dividends. Cost of energy is high, but that will come down with renewable. I know that there are significant green hydrogen plants going in. Some of that planned for energy provision. Some of that's planned as buffers, but you could use that or to use waste heat. So it's really a case of, in the UK, joining all of those different pieces together to have the same effect that kind of pulls a project towards that successful outcome, rather than kind of stepping each piece of it and losing quite a lot of time on the way. But all of those pieces are there if we can get the communication better and tap into the right pools. And I think it's about getting some state impetus and funding behind that, because they can look at the ROI on a plant like that in a way that a private sector investor, they're really looking at cash in, return time and cash out. There's much more to that, particularly if you look at how you tie it into regeneration and how you tie it into the levelling up agenda. If you could quantify that at a government level in terms of the benefit that building a plant house on other costs that may go down in the area, then that's really key to it. They can take a much longer view and a much wider view. You need a bit of that private cash to give it the injection, but they're never going to be able to without having the longer term vision that can only really be brought to bear by a state that has a policy that carries on throughout the fluctuations of the parliamentary changes. I would have said every 5 years, but kind of a bit more frequent than that at the moment. So the policies need to be a bit longer term and better connected, but we've definitely got the ability to do it. We just need to not get caught napping.
Understood. James?
Let's go talk a little bit about maybe the importance of sharing and collaborating on some of these issues. We all want the UK to win. We all want to be successful. We want everybody in this room to be successful. What strikes me is that we all share very similar risks and uncertainties around our growth plans. So the more that we could find ways of pooling some of that risk, perhaps through insurance and other forms of risk financing, I think the more effective we will all be at managing that uncertainty.
Understood. Maybe before I ask you the same question, Robert, before I joined Markets and Markets, I was with Switch Mobility, and we were opening our new factory, and we had a choice: do we expand our factory in Leeds? But we ended up going to Spain. It wasn't that we were asking for money from the government. What we were saying is, can we have a program where the government will buy enough electric buses from us? So maybe a question for you there, Robert. Is that something you think is missing as part of our industrial strategy?
I think it probably is, actually. I mean, if I look at Wrightbus, or our primary manufacturing facility is in Northern Ireland. We also have a manufacturing facility in Malaysia that we primarily use for markets in that part of the world. However, we have very recently just opened a facility in Bicester, in fact last week, looking at some new product lines and also repowering some of our existing vehicle side of it. But it's fair to say that going forward, if we continue to expand and grow in areas that we are, there's a strong possibility that we will have additional manufacturing facilities overseas, and that could quite potentially lead to our existing facilities in the UK becoming smaller, which, you know, there's no real assistance to stop us from doing that. And if you looked at it purely from an accountancy point of view, you'd be wrong not to consider how you can alter things. But certainly right now, you know, we're well established in our current setup, and we're not looking at changing it. But there isn't really any form of encouragement that I can see to avoid moving to lower cost countries for any business in the UK today.
So what would it take for you to build your next factory in the UK?
I think in quite simple terms, we have to be guaranteed that the agreements are in place so that we can export without any real penalty side of it, because that's a big fear for us. I mean, we've got if you like, we should be in the Goldilocks situation in Northern Ireland, because we're obviously in the UK and we're also in the EU, even though that's really complicated and I'm not going to get into any of the details around that. But you know, all we have seen is a significant increase in red tape both ways, if you know what I mean. So it's and you know, going forward, whoever ends up being in government, you know, we do need to make sure that these trade agreements are properly organised, properly sorted out, and that we as a collective group have sight of what's going on as early as possible, because there's definitely a fear that you could end up making the wrong decision, which can make the UK look less attractive. And with it being such a competitive marketplace for zero emission vehicles around the world, you need any advantage you can get. And I mean, it was the classic one for us as being that until recently, you could import a zero emission vehicle into the UK and pay zero duty on it whatsoever, but you had to pay duty on the components that you brought in. So, you know, there was a natural barrier for vehicle manufacture in the UK. I guess it was an attempt to encourage generating the supply chain, but if we'd waited for the UK supply chain to get up to speed, we wouldn't have a business today. So, you know, it's about making sure that it's as level a playing field and that we look after our own in simple terms.
I agree with that. I think 90% of buses on London roads are Chinese built. Yeah. Sorry, James, you wanted to say something?
I was just going to come in and say that that complexity of regulation is everywhere, though. So it's not just a UK challenge. But to put that in a positive light, one of the things I think that sets the UK apart from other regions is that most of our regulation, is principles based rather than rules based, and that makes it easier from a compliance point of view for organisations to tailor their approach, and that allows actually us to export some of that kind of know-how overseas, because if you've got a process in place that meets a certain set of principles that a regulator here is driving, it doesn't take that much to adapt it to US, China, whatever that, some more specific kind of rules that might be coming out of those regions. So it's a good place to kind of learn the craft almost.
Yeah. Now, when we talk about manufacturing, I think we also have to always link it to productivity and efficiency. And Robert, you and I were discussing over a cup of tea earlier this morning. It takes 40, 50 hours or less to build a car, but it takes 1,800 hours to build a bus. And with electric and hydrogen, is that going up or going down? What's your view on productivity?
It's moving around, I suppose, is probably the better way of putting it. So we've got more resource in certain areas in our facility than we would have had previously. There's certainly a lot less goes on our side on the chassis, and more goes on in the body. But the primary reason why we've got such high build hours across the industry is the amount of coach building that still exists, the amount of variation, and that is really being driven by customer needs. Because if you wanted to have effectively a one-size-fits-all product, effectively then you'd be encouraging bringing in Chinese imports and not changing them. So it is a form of protectionism built in, if you like, to the UK bus sector. In that if we've got 100 vehicles from one customer, the chances are that there'll be 5 variants within those 100. And so it's almost a necessary evil, which is why stepping into some from your earlier slides, as we move from 4.0 to 5.0, it's how we continue to improve our efficiencies, reduce the number of build hours, but don't lose the customization options we have.
Excellent, thank you. Moving on to my last question. Final thought on what can we do to ensure success. What does UK automotive need from the next government?
I think one thing that we've got, our manufacturing is slightly different. So for anyone who doesn't know, we're doing tyres, but what that essentially means is it's quite an efficient process and highly automated already. So as long as you're in control of your scrappage rates and tolerances, then you don't have the same kind of complexity of issues. It's very much high volume, process driven. But I think where the government could step in is either helping through raising awareness. I think any product that's going to be manufactured in the UK naturally is going to have a base cost that's relatively high. So you're looking at premium brands, premium products that have got to deliver that high capability. And it's all about how you make the public aware that that's needed, required, or you can look at a bit of stick in terms of looking at where Euro 7, from our point of view, Euro 7, Euro 8 regulations are going, and particularly looking at the overseas regulations that have been brought in California. So I think if you want to look after UK manufacturing, you've got to look after that domestic market as well, because export at the minute is variable depending on what sector you're in. So if you can drive a premium market for what will naturally be a premium expensive product, then I think you sort of solve at least half of that battle of getting something up and running and looking at the scalability.
Thanks, Sam. James, anything?
I think help with some of that transparency challenge I was talking about earlier, helping us understand where those single points of failure are that we all share in our supply chains, and putting some strategy and some policy around that. None of us want to find out we've got, like we had in South Wales, a single point of failure of the CO2 sort of manufacturer a few years ago. Nobody wants to find out on the day of the disruption. There needs to be visibility of that upfront and strategies built around how to secure the supply for what is a critical industry for us here in the UK.
Robert, same question for you. What do we need from the next government other than a clear manifesto?
I think two things. I think we need continued support for purchasing zero emission buses in the UK. We have had good support up until now, but it's questionable how that will continue and also how that will pan out for the whole industry, both operators as well as the manufacturers, if that funding is reduced or potentially withdrawn. The second point for me is we're very proudly British owned, British designed, British built, and we really want to continue that. We want to continue our full commitment to the UK going forward, and so hopefully as the new government takes place, they'll continue negotiating appropriate trade deals so that we can continue to expand from the UK and not be encouraged to open facilities overseas.
Excellent. I guess we have time for one or two questions, or are we up? Ask the audience, anybody please?
Thank you very much. My name is Krasimir Kiryakov. I'm the head of Economic and Commercial section of the Bulgarian Embassy in London. And I work with many British companies who work in the region, the Balkans, Southeast Europe, when they face problems with nearshoring. I would like to ask you to what extent this is your problem as well, and are you looking to build up alternative value chain, supply chain in Eastern Europe? Thank you very much.
Who'd like to take that?
I can, because
Please.
Go for it.
we are at the moment, not quite the same area, but we're looking at off-take manufacturing agreements in the region. They would eventually be superseded once we look at raising the funding to build our own plant, and that replays the argument as to whether that's in the UK or elsewhere. But at the short term, that's quite a key strategic area for us because the industry already has a presence that we would like to capitalise on.
Just come in and say that the techniques that I talked about earlier around mapping your supply chain really rapidly can work when you're thinking about building new relationships with suppliers that perhaps you haven't spoken to before. So doing that mapping and risk assessments process prior to awarding any contracts is time well spent, because you don't want to find out you've just invested in a plant that's on a floodplain that floods every 3 years after you've signed the contract. You want to know that up front. So actually, the conversations around where to invest can be informed by the same kind of process you look when you're looking upstream to your existing supply chain.
Excellent, thank you. One last question. I think we've got a gentleman here. Can somebody pass a mic, please?
Hello, Richard Amenagama from Mikos Technologies. Question here around the microfactory direction. So Arrival were quite big on that idea and things didn't go that well for them. So the question is, how do you keep costs down and drive economies of scale if what you're doing is the opposite?
Yeah, I can try and answer that. So I did actually look quite a bit of work into Arrival's microfactory when I was at Switch. I think they sort of suggested about 50 million per factory, which interestingly, and they were making buses and light commercial vehicles. And tell me, Robert, what do you think? But for 150 million, you can make a full large factory when it comes to making buses. So I thought the pricing was maybe very high on making a microfactory. But I think microfactories have a role to play. In future, if you are looking at specific markets, and because there's this whole geopolitical trend of onshoring, if you're going into a certain market where you don't have large volumes and you just want to create a small factory with limited volumes, you can use the microfactory concept very well. Companies like Arrival, obviously, Canoe, many others. And I think when we move to what we call a skateboard architecture, and if in the top, that allows you to build a top hat. You could build on the same skateboard a light commercial vehicle. You could even build a van or others. So I think despite the cost might be high, and that's debatable because I've had different views. Some people think that's the way forward. But it does give you that flexibility and that modularity that can help you achieve SOP in a smaller markets in a much more rapid way. I don't know if anybody else like to add to it.
I think the arrival case is interesting because fundamentally I think they got their numbers wrong at the start, because to get the level of return for the investment that it had, they needed a significantly higher output than any of the facilities were going to require. And if you look at the complexity of the product, it didn't particularly lend itself to a microfactory setup. So I think for me, microfactories are very, very interesting, but you have to make sure that the product you're trying to produce is actually suited to that form of facility.
Also learn from other sectors. Think about what's happening in the nuclear industry, small modular reactors. None of them have been built yet, but it's the same kind of concept. They're going to be facing the same kind of challenges. So lots of collaboration and sharing to be done there, I think, too.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. I think we're up on time.